The words my father spoke that night had the weight of a bell tolling. They hung in the air of that grand ballroom, settling over the guests like ash after a fire. "This is my lazy fat daughter." He said it with a smile, the kind that curled at the edges. The kind he'd perfected over 72 years of finding new ways to make me smaller. His voice carried across crystal chandeliers and polished marble, across 200 wedding guests who had come to celebrate love, only to witness something else entirely. The laughter came quickly. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. That tinkling, nervous laughter people use when they want to belong, even if belonging means cruelty. I felt their eyes on me, measuring, judging, confirming what my father had just announced. My cheeks burned. The floor beneath my navy blue dress seemed to shift, and for one terrible moment I thought my legs might give out. Then I saw them. 4 young men in matching tuxedos standing near the head table. Groomsmen. They exchanged a single glance. The kind of wordless communication that comes from shared hardship. From nights when silence was the only language that mattered. One of them, the tallest, spoke first. His voice was steady, trained, deliberate. "Sir." The other 3 finished his sentence in perfect unison, as if they'd rehearsed it, though they hadn't. "She's our commanding officer." The sound cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. Sharp. Clean. Final. The room froze. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every fork paused halfway to every mouth. Even the band faltered, the pianist's hands hovering uncertainly over the keys. My father choked. He'd been mid-sip, savouring his moment, and the realization hit him like a fist. Wine sprayed from his mouth in a red arc, splattering across the pristine white tablecloth. He coughed, sputtered, his face draining of colour as understanding crashed over him. The daughter he had just mocked in front of 200 people, the daughter he had spent a lifetime diminishing, was the woman these men stood ready to salute. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment the wedding turned inside out. And my father's world with it. I had known this day would test me. Weddings are supposed to be joyful, but for me they had always been minefields. My only son, Mark, was marrying into the Hastings family, a well-to-do Virginia clan with deep roots and deeper pockets, the kind of family whose wealth seemed woven into the very fabric of their last name. The reception was held at their country club, a sprawling estate where every chandelier dripped with crystal and the waiters moved like shadows, silent and efficient. It was a stage built for judgment, and I had walked onto it, knowing exactly what role I was expected to play. I had chosen my dress with the care of a soldier selecting gear for a mission. Navy blue. Simple. Understated. A single strand of pearls from my late mother rested against my collarbone. My life had taught me that blending in was safer than standing out, especially when my father was in the room. At 72, he had only grown sharper with age, his tongue honed to a cutting edge. He lived for moments when the spotlight found him, even if he had to steal it from someone else, and too often that someone was me. From the time I was old enough to understand words, he had used them as weapons. Big girl. Useless. Slow. Embarrassment. Each one landed with precision, carving away pieces of me until I learned to make myself invisible. My brothers, thinner and louder, earned his approval with ease. I carried the weight of his disappointment the way I would later carry medals on my uniform, quietly, without asking anyone to notice. But what my father never knew, what he never bothered to ask, was that invisibility had given me power. I joined the army at 19. He thought it was a phase that I'd wash out before my first deployment, come crawling back to Ohio with my tail between my legs. Instead, I found the only place I had ever truly belonged. Discipline became my language. Resilience my armor. Years of his ridicule had forged something unbreakable inside me. A core of steel he would never see because he refused to look. I served in Iraq, then Afghanistan, then at bases scattered across the states. My soldiers knew me as Major Carter, then Lieutenant Colonel Carter. By the time my son's wedding arrived, I wore the silver eagle of a full colonel on my uniform. But my father never asked about my work, and I never volunteered the information. Maybe some part of me wanted to keep it hidden. If he couldn't be proud of me, then I would stop offering him opportunities to reject me. So I showed up to family dinners in plain clothes, my ribbons tucked away in a drawer, my deployments reduced to vague mentions of work. To him, I remained what I had always been, the daughter who never measured up, the family embarrassment he tolerated out of obligation. And then came the wedding. Mark had been dating Jennifer Hastings for just over a year. She was everything I wasn't: polished, confident, born into a world where doubt was something other people experienced. A corporate lawyer with sharp suits and sharper instincts. Her family welcomed my son with open arms, though I caught the way their eyes lingered on me during introductions. They were measuring my dress, my shoes, my accent, weighing me against some invisible standard I would never meet. It was the same look my father had been giving me my entire life. During the reception, when Jennifer brought her parents over to meet me, I prepared myself. Her mother's smile was tight, her father's handshake brief and cool. But nothing could have prepared me for my father stepping forward, puffing out his chest like a rooster claiming his territory and saying the words that would echo in my ears for days afterward. "This is my lazy fat daughter." The crowd laughed. Not everyone, but enough. And that was the cruelest part. Laughter spreads like wildfire. People don't always mean it, but they go along because silence feels like taking a side, and taking a side requires courage most people don't have. So they laughed, and I stood there, heat rising in my cheeks, my heart hammering against my ribs. Part of me wanted to run. Another part wanted to shout the truth, to rip open my carefully maintained invisibility and show them exactly who I was. But I didn't need to. My soldiers did it for me. The groomsmen had served under my command in Afghanistan. I hadn't known they would be at the wedding. Mark had met them after moving back home, had become friends with them over beers and baseball games, never realizing the connection. They had kept it quiet out of respect for me, understanding instinctively that I kept my two worlds separate for a reason. But when they heard my father's words, when they saw 200 people laugh at their commanding officer, they decided enough was enough. "Sir," the tall one said, his voice carrying the weight of authority even in a tuxedo. "She's our commanding officer." The phrase dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples in every direction. The laughter died instantly, as if someone had cut a wire. Guests turned to stare, first at the young men, then at me, trying to reconcile what they thought they knew with what they were hearing. My father sputtered, red-faced, wine dripping down his chin and onto his shirt. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words that wouldn't come. And in that silence, for the first time in decades, I felt the balance of power shift. I wasn't the one exposed anymore. He was. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stood still, letting the truth hang in the air like smoke. My soldiers looked at me with the respect they had always shown, the respect my father had never given. The respect I had earned not through family ties, but through years of service, of leading people home, of making impossible decisions in impossible situations. The orchestra fell silent. Someone set down a glass, and the sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. The Hastings family looked stunned, their polite superiority crumbling before my eyes. Jennifer's mother's hand fluttered to her throat. Her father's expression shifted from confusion to something like understanding, though he couldn't quite grasp all of it yet. And my son, my dear Mark, looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. Which in a way he was. It wasn't just the end of a cruel joke. It was the beginning of a reckoning that had been decades in the making. People think humiliation happens all at once in a loud room with witnesses. But most humiliation is patient. It trains you slowly, teaching you to take up less space, to speak more quietly, to apologize for existing. It happens inch by inch until you are a whisper in your own life, barely audible even to yourself. I grew up on a 2-lane road outside Chillicothe, Ohio, where the neighbors knew the mileage on every truck and the price of every bale of hay. My father ran a small plumbing and HVAC business out of a cinder block shop behind our house. His work shirts always smelled of copper and furnace dust. He was good with systems. Pipes and valves and thermostats, things that followed clear rules. He was terrible with people, especially the people under his own roof. If a pipe leaked, he tightened it. If a child hurt, he mocked it. That was his method. Tighten. Mock. Move on. By 5th grade, I was big. Not the biggest kid in town, but big enough for the jokes to land. My mother tried to intercept them with casseroles and kindness, the way women of her generation patched everything with food and apologies. She loved me out loud and he cut me down in public, and those two forces cancelled each other out until I felt like I equaled 0. On Sundays, we sat in a polished pew beneath a stained glass window of wheat and water. The preacher spoke about grace, and afterward my father would shake his hand and tell him he'd done a fine job. Then, in the parking lot, he would squeeze my upper arm like he was checking a melon for ripeness and say, "We're laying off the donuts this week, right?" The men around us would laugh, that knowing laugh of camaraderie, and the women would look away, their silence louder than any words. Humiliation loves a parking lot. It loves witnesses who won't intervene. I learned early that invisibility was survival. If I couldn't be pretty, I could be useful. I stacked parts in Dad's shop, swept floors, balanced the checkbook on a yellow legal pad with careful columns. He relied on my organization while ridiculing my body. "You'd be perfect if you came with a shut-off valve," he told me once in front of a supplier, and the men laughed while I pretended not to hear. I got good at pretending. In high school, I ran cross-country in an oversized t-shirt. My times were average, but I liked the private victory of steady pace. No applause, no audience, just breath and grit and the knowledge that I could endure. A guidance counselor slid a brochure for the army across her desk during my senior year. "You're organized and stubborn," she said, studying me over her reading glasses. "Those traits go far in the service." My father laughed when I brought it up at dinner. "You'll quit the first time a drill sergeant yells," he said, chewing with his mouth open. "You can't even handle a hill run without wheezing." My mother pressed her napkin to her lips and said nothing. In our house, silence was always the safest answer. I signed the enlistment papers on my lunch break and hid the carbon copies in my geometry binder. The day I shipped out, my father stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops like a man surveying property he owned. "Try not to embarrass us," he said. I lifted my duffel bag and didn't look back. On the bus, I watched the farms blur into factories and then into the gates of a military base with metal beds and shouted schedules. I made a decision that day. I would become very, very good at following orders. Boot camp rewarded neatness and stubbornness. So did the army. The voice in my head changed from my father's cutting remarks to a drill sergeant's bark, and somehow that felt like mercy. The sergeant didn't know my history. He didn't care about my body except as a tool to be sharpened. He only cared whether my boots were shined. My bunk was tight. My time on the obstacle course beat yesterday's. I could work with that. Work became refuge when your worth has always been contested. My first deployment came 2 years later. Iraq. Heat that made your skin feel like it was stapled on. Sand that found its way into every crease and corner. Then Afghanistan. Mountains that punished you and men who would follow you if you proved you could be counted on. I learned 1,000 small reliabilities. How to read a map by red light. How to listen to a private without making him feel inspected. How to say we go together in a dozen different tones until it became true. I wrote home in neutral sentences. I'm well. The food is fine. The sunsets are prettier than you'd think. When I earned my first commendation, I didn't mention it. When my mother mailed me a newspaper clipping about my brother getting a promotion at the dealership, I wrote back, "Tell him I'm proud." It was easier to keep the family ledger balanced by not entering my own numbers. Promotions arrived the way dawn does, gradual then obvious. I pinned on captain, then major. I learned to keep a straight face when a young private accidentally called me sir. In rooms full of men, I spoke low and precise, and somehow the words carried farther than volume ever could. There is a kind of authority that doesn't announce itself. It simply refuses to be ignored. When my mother's heart failed, I flew home in my Class A uniform because there was no time to change. At the funeral, the pews were the same, and the wheat and water still poured coloured light across the same aisle where I'd sat as a child. Women I'd known since childhood squeezed my hands and whispered, "Your mama bragged on you something fierce." My father shook the preacher's hand and said she was a good woman, like he was commenting on a furnace that had finally given up. On the church steps, a neighbour asked about my uniform. "Just office work," my father said before I could answer. "She files papers and tries not to break a sweat." I accepted the dish of macaroni someone handed me and went inside. After that, I stopped bringing my uniform home. I showed up in jeans and soft cardigans that made me look like an elementary school secretary. My father had always wanted me smaller. I obliged in the only dimension I could control visibility. The less he knew, the less he could use against me. When a ribbon appeared on my rack for something I didn't care to relive, I pushed it to the back of my closet and told myself that heroism didn't require an audience. Years later, when I took command of a battalion, the weight of it felt right in my hands, like a wrench I'd used my whole life. My soldiers were a patchwork quilt of America farm kids, first-generation college grads, A baker from Baton Rouge who could disassemble a radio blindfolded, a kid from Queens who recited psalms before patrols. They didn't need me thin. They needed me steady. In that steadiness, I found a dignity I could stand inside, a dignity that didn't require my father's approval. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, my father's shop molded with rust and modest success in equal parts. He bragged about my brother's promotions and sent me photos of their new trucks. At Christmas, he carved the ham while listing his own aches like medals. Knee, shoulder, back, dignity. You should try losing some weight, he told me between helpings. It's not healthy. I wanted to tell him about the rucksacks I'd carried, the miles I'd marched, the nights I'd measured out fear in careful doses and still did the job. Instead, I passed the rolls and asked for the salt. I had learned somewhere along the line that winning with him meant refusing to play his game. When Mark was born, my father smiled at the infant in a way he had never smiled at me. I didn't hold it against him. Babies are safe from comparison. As my son grew, I practiced a new language with him, praise that wasn't conditional, boundaries that weren't barbed. When his father left, I carried the weight of 2 jobs and kept our home tidy, because tidiness is a kind of mercy when life is loud. Mark learned to tighten a faucet and make his bed on the same day. I told him that strength isn't loud and power isn't cruel. And when he brought home report cards, I put them on the fridge without turning them into a referendum on his worth as a human being. Somewhere in the middle of deployments and school pickups, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would stop auditioning for a role I had already played and lost. My father's favorite. Favor is weather, unpredictable and fleeting. Respect is climate. I couldn't control the weather inside him, but I could build a climate inside myself that wouldn't shift with his moods. Years of silence passed this way. Disciplined, chosen, sometimes lonely, always safer than the alternative. I wore my rank in the places it mattered and hung it on a hook by the door when I came home. In a small town where people counted other people's portions and measured other people's worth by the shininess of their cars, I learned to count my own breaths and call it enough. And then Mark fell in love, and a wedding invitation arrived like an inspection notice from the universe. Family gathers around milestones the way dust gathers in corners you haven't looked at in a while. I knew what that ballroom would test. I didn't expect it to shatter everything my father thought he knew, but I was done needing him to measure me. I had my own standard now. The Hastings Country Club had the kind of parking lot where the cars all had names. S-Class, Range Rover, Escalade, lined up nose to nose like prize cattle at the county fair. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. That particular scent of privilege so ingrained it becomes invisible to the people who live in it. A teenage attendant in a crisp tuxedo pointed me toward the coat check with 2 fingers and a practiced smile. I thanked him and kept my wrap even though the air was warm. Old habits. You don't put down what you might need if the room turns hostile. The ballroom was decorated in what most people call champagne and carpenters call expensive paint. Round tables dressed in white linens, a bandstand draped in velvet, a dance floor polished to a nervous shine. Someone had thought of everything place cards in a calligrapher's elegant hand. Centerpieces of garden roses and eucalyptus that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Little chalkboard signs at the bar offering signature cocktails named after the couple. You can tell a lot about a family by their bar menu. The Hastings offered a Hastings old-fashioned made with top-shelf bourbon and house-made cherry syrup. It told me they liked tradition, but only the expensive kind, the kind you could brag about at the country club. Jennifer was radiant, I'll give her that. She wore lace that wasn't fussy and heels she didn't wobble in. Her hair was styled in that effortless way that takes hours and costs hundreds, the careful construction of casualness. When she saw me, she threaded through the guests like a boat cutting through calm water. "You look lovely, Emily," she said, and I nodded and told her the truth. So do you. 2 things can be true at once. She could be kind to me in one breath and part of a world that would dismiss me in the next. A person's character isn't simple. It's the map of their choices over time. And I had learned to navigate carefully. The Hastings guests had that country club ease that reads as friendliness from a distance, but reveals itself as inventory taking up close. I caught the sideways glances at my dress, at my shoes polished but not precious, at my hair pinned back in the way women who prefer function over fashion tend to do it. "There's Mark's mother," I heard a woman whisper behind her program. "She looks practical." Practical is what people say when they don't want to say plain. I've been called worse. My father arrived late, as he always did when punctuality would suggest deference to anyone else's schedule. He wore a suit a shade too shiny and a tie that looked like a loud argument. He kissed my cheek and left the smell of aftershave and menthol on my skin. "Don't cry," he said. "Mascara will run." It wasn't advice. It was a reminder your face is a thing that can fail you in public. The ceremony was honest and short. The pastor kept to love and duty and avoided the kind of jokes that turn holy things into comedy routines. Mark's hand shook when he slid the ring onto Jennifer's finger, and I loved him for having nerves. If love doesn't make you tremble a little, you're either lying or not paying attention. When they kissed, I felt my mother like a warm presence on my shoulder, and I blinked back tears that had nothing to do with mascara. During photos, I drifted to the edge of the lawn and watched the grounds crew wheel a cart of lemonade through the shade of old oak trees. Weddings are exercises in logistics timelines, backups, contingencies. I felt calmer imagining the day as a mission plan. At 200 p.m., move guests from chapel to ballroom. At 2:15, first round of appetizers. At 2:30, announce wedding party. My mind has always sought anchors in details. I suppose that's why I became good at the work I do. Solvable problems steady the unsolvable ones. The reception opened the way receptions do applause. A flurry of napkins being placed on laps. The band easing into something familiar so people wouldn't have to pretend to enjoy it. I was seated with two couples who played golf with the Hastings every Wednesday. "We never miss nine and dine," the woman to my left said. And her husband added, 18 holes and dinner with the same 4 jokes. And the table laughed like it was funny to admit they only had 4 jokes between them. Small talk builds scaffolding for hours we don't yet know what to do with. We discussed the weather, the quality of the roast beef, the rising price of flights to Naples. They asked what I did, and I gave them the version that fit in a cocktail glass. "Administrative work," I said. "Lots of planning and coordination. It's not a lie if it's incomplete. Most people want a story they can set down easily. I'd learned to hand them something light." The groom's side had filled their half of the room with bankers and lawyers, and a sprinkling of minor officials who held the soft power of permits and zoning decisions. The bride's grandmother wore a brooch that could fund a small college if you melted it down and auctioned the stones. The flower girl, bored now that there were no petals left to scatter, had invented a game on the carpet that seemed to involve rescuing napkin rings from an imaginary flood. I first noticed the groomsmen at the bar, not because they were loud, but because they weren't. There's a particular quiet to men who have carried weight together, a way they occupy space without claiming it. They leaned without slumping, scanned the room without seeming to. One had a scar near his temple that disappeared into his hairline. Another held his glass in his left hand but wore his watch on his right wrist. Small details, the kind my training had taught me to notice. The kind my father would never see because he only noticed things that confirmed what he already believed. By the time the salads had been cleared and the prime rib arrived with a flourish beef, and horseradish cream announced like visiting dignitaries, the noise had thickened into that polite roar you get at large events. Someone clinked a glass and attempted a toast. The band struck a wrong chord and recovered. A toddler near the head table executed a jailbreak from a booster seat and was corralled like a joyful calf. It was an American wedding, beautifully ordinary in all the ways that matter. And then my father stood. I felt the shift before he spoke a single word. He drew himself up the way men do when they're about to ride a wave of their own making. He hadn't been asked to speak. I knew that because Jennifer was the kind of bride who built detailed run-of-show documents, and the wedding planner tried a subtle shake of her head from the margins. He didn't see it. He never has when the sign says yield. He tapped his glass with a butter knife until the noise softened and faces turned toward him. Faces that didn't know him well enough to dread him yet. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced ease, "I just want to say a word about family." I could have written his next 5 sentences from memory. They were the same ones he'd used at graduations and funerals and the occasional company picnic. He always started with a joke because jokes provide deniability. If you object, you can't take a joke. If you laugh, you participated. It's a neat trick if you don't mind buying power with someone else's dignity. He thanked the Hastings for hosting, made a crack about all this fancy food and how in our house we call this many forks a problem, and got a laugh that warmed him like whiskey. He gestured to Mark with a flourish and said he was proud, which was probably true, and then his hand found me and I felt the light move with it. This he said, and the room grew quiet enough to hear the band leader's shoes scuff against the stage. This is my lazy, fat daughter. The words weren't new in their content, only in their audience. I had been called worse names by him at gas pumps, in grocery aisles, on church steps, but words thrown into a microphone travel farther. They land harder. I stood very still. If your face doesn't move, sometimes time doesn't either. Laughter broke around me like hail on a tin roof. Not everyone, God bless the few who held themselves back, but enough. Enough to scratch. Enough to mock. Jennifer's mother brought a hand to her throat and made a small sound that might have been shock or might have been etiquette, failing under pressure. A cousin coughed into his fist the way people do when they want to hide a grin. At my table, the golf couples looked down as if their salad plates had suddenly become fascinating archaeological discoveries. My son stared at his water glass like it might tell him what to do. It's not easy to be a good son and a good man at the same time when the room asks you to choose between them. I did not speak. There are fights you win by leaving them hungry. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the groomsmen straighten. Not like soldiers yet, just like men adjusting to carry a weight they hadn't expected. The one with the scar murmured something to the tall one with the careful watch. The tall one shook his head once as if to say, not yet. There's a choreography to intervention. You wait until the harm is clear to everyone, not just to yourself. My father wasn't done. Bullies rarely are when the crowd is warm and receptive. He launched into a story about me at 12, about some Little League fundraiser where I supposedly ate 3 hot dogs. We laughed and laughed at Big M, the bottomless pit, he said, and the crowd chuckled along. The details were wrong. My brother had eaten 2 of those hot dogs, but accuracy isn't the point of a performance. The point is securing the audience's consent. I looked at my hands resting on the white linen. My nails were plain and cut short for practicality. These were the hands that had cleaned a rifle last month, that had signed a promotion order changing a young sergeant's life, that had held my son's face when fever scared him at 5 years old. The same hands, but my son didn't know. My father didn't care. Someone at the head table tried to redirect. Let's toast the bride and groom, the planner's assistant said, her voice bright as a lifeguard's whistle. My father waved the suggestion aside like a gnat. He was warming to his theme now, the crowd responding in those little obliging ripples that tell a speaker he's safe to continue. I could map the next minute of damage before it landed, could see exactly where he was headed. Across the room, the groomsmen's eyes met mine, not asking for permission exactly, looking for alignment. I gave them the smallest nod a person can give and still be seen. They set down their glasses with deliberate precision. They didn't snap to attention. They didn't salute. They just put down their glasses and spoke together, the way men do when they've carried rucksacks in the same rain, when they've watched each other's backs in places where one mistake means someone doesn't come home. Sir, the tall one said, his voice level and clear. She's our commanding officer. It wasn't loud, but it cut through every other sound in that room. The words left them like a level line and sliced the ballroom clean in half, before and after, laughter and silence, ridicule and reckoning. My father blinked as if the room had shifted and he'd stayed still. Someone near the head table sucked in breath too fast and choked. A waiter froze mid-pour. A woman's bracelet chimed against the stem of her glass, and the sound rang out like a small bell. My father tried to grin, then to swallow, and did both badly. He lifted his wine glass as if the motion could provide cover, took a nervous sip, and the truth hit him mid-swallow. Red wine sprayed across the white tablecloth in a perfect fan. You could hear it land, hear each individual drop find its place in the sudden silence. The tall groomsman, Staff Sergeant Miller, though the room didn't need his name, kept his voice even and respectful. "With respect, sir," he said to the space where my father's authority had been just moments before. "Mom led us in Coast Province. We'd prefer you speak of her accordingly." Prefer. Such a tidy word for drawing a line in the sand. The band stopped pretending to vamp. The last piano note hung in the air like a moth and died. A cluster of teenagers drifted backward instinctively, the way flocks do when they sense a predator. At my table, the golf couples became sudden experts on bread plates and butter knives. Jennifer's mother found her necklace again, her fingers working the pearls like rosary beads in a storm. The room had 1,000 hands, and every hand was looking for a place to hide. "Commanding what?" my father managed, the syllables themselves seeming to turn on him. Miller didn't answer with rank or title. He answered with memory, with the kind of truth that can't be argued with. Coast, he said softly, each word weighted with meaning. Convoy Bravo. June. Mom was the one who went vehicle to vehicle when the comms died. She's the reason Lewis got home to teach his daughter how to ride a bike. His jaw worked once, the way men's jaws do when they're pushing back whatever would make their voices break. She's our CO, sir. Mom, the scarred one Corporal Dodato added, his voice carrying a kind of finality. Permission to clarify. I met his eyes and saw the question there, the offer. Go ahead, I said quietly. He looked at my father, and when he spoke, his words were measured and clear. Sir, you don't have to like us, but you're going to respect her. It didn't come out tough or threatening. It came out true, and truth has a weight that bullies can't lift. My father stared at me like I'd participated in an elaborate trick, like I'd somehow orchestrated this moment to humiliate him. For once in his life, he ran out of script. He groped for a laugh, then for a shrug, then for his napkin, and settled for dabbing at the wine stain as if it were the real problem. Well, he said to no one, then to everyone. Well now. Across the head table, the best man, who had been ready with a practiced joke about marriage being like advanced warfare, closed his mouth and lifted his glass to hide behind. Jennifer looked from the groomsmen to me, confusion melting into calculation, into something that looked like dawning respect. Her father tried on a smile that hadn't been tailored for this moment and found it didn't fit quite right. Colonel? Someone whispered behind me, and the word moved across the tables like ripples on water, hopping from curiosity to certainty without stopping to verify facts. I didn't correct it. I didn't confirm it. I let the room do the arithmetic it had failed to do for years. The planner, bless her professional heart, tried to restart time. She clapped once and said, "Let's welcome our newlyweds to the dance floor," with the bright courage of someone who believes sound can fix what silence has broken. People clapped, but their hearts weren't in it yet. They were too busy reshuffling everything they thought they knew. I could have stepped into that quiet and filled it. I could have recited my service record, listed my deployments, explained exactly why I'd kept my rank off the holiday table. But a good officer knows when not to give a briefing. I stood there and let their eyes do what eyes have to do before minds follow. Let them adjust to a new truth. Miller shifted an inch closer to the other groomsmen, as if to say that if gravity failed, they would provide a substitute. Dodato's scar caught a glint of chandelier light and made a small star against his temple. The watch on the left-handed groomsman's wrist kept ticking the same steady tick, no matter how the room felt about anything. I took comfort in that. Machines keep time. Good men keep faith. My son stood, his chair legs scraping against the parquet floor in protest. He looked down at his hands, then up at me, then at the men who had just shifted the entire gravity of the room. He has my mother's eyes, steady even when the rest of him isn't. "Mom," he said. Soft, simple. And that was the first honor that truly mattered. My father reached for bluster like a man reaching for a railing in the dark. "Just a joke," he said, aiming for Hardy and hitting hollow. "Can't anybody around here take a sir?" Miller said. Not loud. Final. It's a strange thing to watch power move. It doesn't thunder or crash. It relocates quietly, absolutely, from the mouth that misused it to the people who won't. You could feel it settle into new places in that room. A glass fell somewhere. Small, one of those slim water glasses with a fragile stem. It hit the floor and broke politely, the way expensive things do, with a neat and decisive sound. Near the bar, a guest exhaled a laugh they tried to swallow and ended up coughing into a napkin. Laughter had become risky. That's the beginning of new manners. "Jennifer," her mother said, her voice tight with something between confusion and accusation. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because it wasn't my story to tell," Jennifer answered, surprising me with her clarity. "And because we didn't ask." The room learned a second lesson in that moment. You can be wealthy and still teachable. The band leader, showing mercy, chose a tune that had backbone, something with a jazz arrangement that could hold weight, and let the pianist find a chord that said we could all try again if we wanted to. People sat. The toddler resumed the flood game at the edge of the dance floor. Life, which had paused to take attendance, started checking names again. "Mom," Dodato said quietly, as if we were standing in a hallway instead of in the middle of a chandeliered storm. "We've got your 6. I nodded once, my throat tight. "I know." My father looked at me and found no daughter he recognized. He had always mistaken my endurance for emptiness. my quiet for a void that could be filled with his voice. I watched recognition climb his face like weather moving across a landscape. And then I watched it pass without landing anywhere useful. He set his jaw, picked up his knife as if dinner were the problem, not his mouth. His hand shook just enough to catch the candlelight and betray him. The planner approached me with the practiced smile of a nurse and the bravery of someone who gets paid to fix disasters. "We're moving to toasts," she whispered. "Would you like to say something?" The question was a bridge, a way for the room to cross from spectacle back to sense. I could feel every eye rehearsing what I might do with a microphone. I could spend this moment on revenge. I had a balance due and a captive audience. But training outlasts appetite. When your soldiers intervene because your father forgot how to be a decent human being, you remember who you're responsible to. I walked to the small platform where the microphone waited. I adjusted it with 2 fingers and let the feedback find and lose me. When I spoke first to the men who had stood up. "Thank you," I said, "because gratitude is the right flag to raise when you're choosing what kind of story this becomes." Then I faced the room. "I'm not here to correct anybody's version of history," I said clearly. "I'm here to celebrate 2 people who chose each other." I looked at Mark and Jennifer, let my gaze rest on them with the kind of steadiness I'd learned in command. Marriage is the art of honor in close quarters. You don't have to be perfect to be honorable. You just have to tell the truth, especially when it would be easier not to. I let my gaze pass over my father without stopping. Mercy refuses to audition for approval. "In my line of work," I continued, "we say quiet professionalism. Do the hard things. Speak softly. Get your people home." I lifted my glass and the light caught it, sent tiny rainbows dancing across the white tablecloth. "Here's to 2 good people getting each other home." The room stood. Not all at once, but in that wave that means something has been decided without a formal vote. They drank. The pianist found a happier key and began to play something that felt like possibility. A waiter whisked away the wine-stained cloth as efficiently as field medics applying a tourniquet. My father did not stand, but he didn't speak either. Progress is sometimes subtraction. When the applause settled, the band found a dance tune and people moved. Because moving is what humans do when they've been reminded of gravity and want to test if they can still walk. The groomsmen went back to being men in tuxedos with clean shoes and easy postures. Tudato passed me with a nod that contained more history than the room would ever read. Miller smiled the small, unphotographed smile of a man who has watched his commanding officer stand still in exactly the right moment. I exhaled. The air felt earned. The night would have more small negotiations and quiet braveries, but the shape of it had changed. I could feel it in my bones. Power had been returned not to me, but to the truth. And truth, once it finds its voice, doesn't easily go quiet again. The applause ended, but the silence didn't. It lingered in corners, settled into the spaces between people. Heavy as humidity before a summer storm. Guests picked up forks, tried to pretend the roast beef still mattered. But the rhythm of dinner had been permanently broken. Laughter doesn't grow back easily after it's been choked out of a room. I sat down without ceremony. Miller and the other groomsmen melted back into the crowd like men who had never stepped out of it. Their tuxedos neat again, their glasses refilled, their postures relaxed. But the shift they'd caused remained, visible in the way people looked at me now, the way space seemed to open around me differently. The Hastings family, who had opened their country club like a theatre for this performance, now wore the expressions of theatre-goers who'd realised halfway through that they were actually in someone else's tragedy. Jennifer's mother kept dabbing at her mouth with her napkin, as if erasing words she hadn't said but wished she had. Her father fiddled with his cufflinks, eyes darting between me and my father like a man watching a tennis match he didn't understand the rules of. My son Mark squeezed Jennifer's hand under the table like a drowning man clinging to driftwood, the only real thing in a room that had become strange and uncertain. My father busied himself with the stain on his shirt. He poured water from a crystal pitcher onto his napkin and rubbed at the wine spots as if they were the central problem of his life, not the words that had caused them. He muttered something about a joke gone wrong, but no one was laughing anymore. No one would be laughing for a while. Whispers moved through the crowd like smoke through rafters. Colonel. Afghanistan. Convoy. People don't need detailed explanations. They need a headline that makes sense of what they've just witnessed. And the headline was clear enough: the woman who had been mocked had already carried more weight than most of them would see in a lifetime. a young cousin of the bride, emboldened by champagne and youth and the strange energy that had taken over the room, leaned toward me with wide eyes. "Is it true?" she asked, her tone half awe, half hunger for gossip. "Were you really over there?" I looked at her and chose kindness over spectacle, the way I'd learned to do when dealing with civilians who wanted war stories they could package neatly. "Yes," I said simply. "And so were many people better than me." Her eyes widened further and she sat back, chastened by the humility in my answer. Sometimes refusing to perform is more powerful than any performance. The band struck up a waltz, but the dance floor remained mostly empty. No one wanted to be the first to pretend that normal had returned, that we could all just move on as if nothing had shifted in the foundation of the evening. My father chewed each bite of beef like it had personally wronged him, his jaw working hard, his eyes fixed on his plate. Across the room, the groomsmen talked quietly among themselves. Their faces relaxed now, but their presence unmistakable. Everyone knew they weren't just friends of the groom anymore. They were living testimony. When the time came for formal toasts, the best man stumbled through a speech that had been light and joking on paper, but now sagged under the weight of what the evening had become. He skipped the punchlines. The maid of honor cried halfway through hers, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't quite name, and no one minded. Sentiment felt safer than humor now. And then the microphone came to me again. I hadn't planned to speak a second time. I never plan these things, but sometimes silence can turn into its own kind of complicity. And I had lived too many years in silence already. I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in that room, and let them wait a beat. 2 beats. I wasn't planning to give another toast, I began, and a small ripple of relieved laughter passed through the room. Not cruel this time, just human. Just grateful for any lessening of tension. But I want to say something simple. Marriage isn't about perfection. It's about honoring close quarters. It's about telling the truth when it would be easier not to. And it's about showing respect, especially when respect is the hardest thing to give. I raised my glass, catching the light again. So here's to Mark and Jennifer. May you always honor each other, not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones. Not just when it's convenient, but when it costs you something. The room stood as one. Glasses met in the air with soft chimes. For the first time that night, applause came without hesitation or calculation. It wasn't for me. It was for the reminder that dignity can be learned, can be practiced, can be recovered even in real time. My father didn't clap. He stared at his plate, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line I'd known my entire life. But he didn't speak either. He didn't try to reclaim the microphone or the moment. And in our family, that silence was its own kind of progress. Later, during the first dance, I stepped back to the rear of the ballroom. A woman I didn't know touched my arm gently. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Thank you for your service," she whispered. And there was something in her voice that suggested she understood the cost of those words in a way most people didn't. I nodded, unable to form words around the sudden tightness in my throat. Praise feels strange when you've spent years hiding your light, like sunshine in a room that's been dark too long. By the time the cake was cut and the dance floor finally filled with couples brave enough to pretend everything was fine, the story had already traveled through every conversation in that room. Strangers approached me with questions, with gratitude, with curiosity burning in their eyes. Some wanted details of medals and missions, and I gave them none. Some just wanted to shake my hand, and I gave them all of that. But the only eyes I really wanted to meet were my father's, and he avoided them all night. He slipped out early, before the cake was even served, mumbling something about traffic and the long drive home. His empty chair at the family table was a sharper statement than anything he might have said. Still, I didn't chase him. I didn't follow him into the parking lot demanding an apology or acknowledgement. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need his recognition to validate what I'd done, who I'd become. The truth had already stood up for me. And when truth stands, everyone else in the room has to follow or be left behind. The morning after the wedding, my house smelled like coffee and flowers that had given up. My kitchen counter held a parade of vases that Mark and Jennifer couldn't fit in their car, and every blossom bowed its head like it had stayed up too late and paid the price. I stood at the sink with a mug cupped in both hands, watching a sparrow bully a blue jay off the bird feeder. The sparrow was half the size of the jay, but it won through sheer determination. Size is a poor predictor of victory. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. My phone lit up with messages. Old friends from town who had been at the reception. Wrote the kind of texts people send when they aren't sure whether to congratulate you or apologize on your behalf. Proud of you. Sorry about your dad. Did that really happen? I set the phone face down on the counter. The truth didn't need replies or explanations. Mark called around 9. We're driving up to the lake for 2 days, he said, his voice sanded down by exhaustion and emotion. Jen's folks rented a cabin. You okay, Mom? I am, I said. And I meant it in the only way that matters I could breathe without counting. Could stand in my own skin without apologizing for taking up space. Enjoy your honeymoon sprint. He hesitated, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. Mom, last night what you said. Thank you for not, lighting anyone on fire? I offered. He huffed a tired laugh. Yeah. I wasn't the one who saved the room, I said quietly. A few good men did. They said you saved them first, he replied, his voice soft with something like wonder. In Afghanistan. Multiple times. We let that sit for a moment. I'll call when we're back, he said finally. After we hung up, I wrote a short note to Jennifer on good stationery. Thank you for your answer last night. It wasn't my story to tell. That took grace. I sealed it and left it on the counter for Mark to find later. Some bridges need careful engineering. By noon, the town had metabolized the event the way small towns do quickly, loudly, with many witnesses comparing notes. The diner waitress added an extra slice of bacon to my BLT and pretended she hadn't. At the hardware store, an older man who never made eye contact with anyone paused at the end of my aisle, cleared his throat and said simply, Mom, like it was a military salute rendered in civilian clothing. I nodded back, understanding that there are handshakes that don't require touching hands. My father didn't call that day. He didn't call the next day either. On the third day, I put on my walking shoes and headed toward his shop. The roll-up door was half open, the way he kept it when he was working, but didn't want to commit to being available. The smell hit me first. Oil and old cardboard and metal shavings, thick and familiar as childhood. A radio played classic country, soft enough that he could pretend he wasn't really listening. He sat on a stool at the workbench with a ledger open in front of him, a pencil gripped in his fist like he was threatening the numbers into submission. He didn't look up when I stepped inside. You're open, I said. Not a question, just an observation. Always am, he replied to the ledger. I stood a few feet away the way you approach a skittish animal that might bolt. I brought back the socket set you loaned me, I said, setting it on the bench. I marked the ones that were actually yours. He grunted, which in our family's native language meant both thank you and go on at the same time. I thought we should talk, I said. We talked enough Saturday, he said without looking up. No, I said firmly. You talked. Then other people did. I'd like my turn now. He set the pencil down with exaggerated care, like a man handling a live fuse. If this is about your big moment, it's about all the little moments, I interrupted. Parking lots, church steps, Christmas dinners. Every time you chose a laugh over my dignity. He flinched, not because he didn't remember, but because he did. Every single time. Silence held us like old rope, fraying but still connected. In the corner, a box fan rattled against its grill with every fifth rotation, marking time neither of us wanted to acknowledge. It was a joke, he finally said, but the words came out weak, rehearsed. Jokes are supposed to be funny to the person who hears them, I said, not just the person who tells them. He took that like a physical blow, rubbing his jaw as if my words had landed with actual force. People laughed, he tried again. And then they didn't, I said. That's the part I'd like you to remember. The silence after. The way those young men stood up. The way everyone in that room looked at you differently afterward. His eyes slid to the radio as if the right song might offer him a better defense. When none came, he tried a different approach. You never said what you did, he muttered. You never told me. You never asked, I said, and let that truth settle between us like dust. You filled in the blanks with the story you preferred. The disappointing daughter. The family embarrassment. It was easier than finding out who I actually was. He sniffed dismissively. Military's just a job. It is, I agreed. And so is being a father. That one landed exactly where I aimed it. He looked at the ledger again, his fingers drumming once, twice on the worn paper. So what do you want? He asked finally. An apology written in blood? I want you to stop, I said simply. Not just the big performances like Saturday night. The small cuts, too. The way you say big girl when you mean beneath me. The way you introduce me to people with jokes about my weight before they even know my name. I want you to stop buying power with my dignity. He stared at me, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man he'd been when I was 5, and he'd let me hand him wrenches in this very shop. How careful he'd been then with language Phillips' flathead crescent, as if words themselves were tools that could fix anything if you used them right. He looked older than he had in the ballroom, maybe because there were no stage lights here to lie on his behalf. Just harsh fluorescent tubes and honest shadows. "What if I can't?" he said, and it wasn't a dare. It sounded like a confession. "What if this is just who I am? Then we'll see each other less," I said, keeping my voice level. "I will not bring myself to places where I'm not respected, and I will not bring my son to watch his grandfather tear down his mother." He nodded once sharply as if taking a critical measurement. "You got hard," he said, and there was something almost like admiration in it. "I got clear," I corrected. "There's a difference." He thumbed the edge of the ledger paper, leaving a small smudge of graphite on his finger. "And if I say I'm sorry?" he asked quietly. "If I actually manage that? Then you're sorry," I said, "and we begin again. Not erase what happened. Begin something new. Beginning isn't the same as forgetting." He closed the ledger, pushed it aside, and got off the stool the way older men do when the floor has unexpectedly risen to meet them. Slow, cautious. Privately surprised the room still holds their weight. "There's a service at the Veterans Memorial on Saturday," he said after a long pause. "They're dedicating a new plaque." Another pause, this one painful in its awkwardness. "I could stand there, with you, if you want." A simpler version of me would have had an answer: ready pride, resentment, the satisfaction of a door closed softly but firmly. But I could hear my mother's voice in the quieter parts of me, the parts that hadn't been entirely beaten down. "If he reaches, let him at least touch the air." "Okay," I said. Saturday. Saturday was bright in that Ohio way, where the sky tries to apologize for all the winters it's put you through. The memorial sits on a square of grass between the library and the post office, a granite wall with names chiseled in neat rows, each one representing a life that ended far from home. A handful of townspeople had gathered Boy Scouts in merit badge sashes, a retired teacher with a flag pin on her cardigan, a woman in scrubs holding a toddler on her hip. The mayor said the expected things without embarrassing the occasion. When they uncovered the new plaque bronze, already darkening in the morning air, an older Marine in dress blues saluted with a hand that trembled and a jaw that didn't. We stood near the back. My father had shaved carefully. His tie was quiet, a muted blue instead of his usual loud patterns. He didn't talk. He didn't grab my arm to steer me like I was a shopping cart. He simply stood next to me, as if proximity was a sentence he was learning to pronounce one word at a time. After the prayers, a few men approached to shake my hand, veterans who recognized something in the way I carried myself. My father let them. He didn't interrupt to translate me into smaller, more manageable words. He didn't jump in with a joke to deflect attention from me back to himself. He just stood there and let me be seen. On the walk back to his truck, he said abruptly, "I've been mean my whole life." "You've been afraid," I said, surprising myself with the generosity of it. "Mean is just how afraid dresses for work." He grunted, considering this. "You going to fix me now? Make me a project?" "I can't fix you," I said. "I can only draw a map to the line. You have to choose to walk across it." We stopped by his truck's tailgate and stood there like two people who had built something together decades ago and weren't sure if it would still hold weight. He looked at my hands, scarred and capable. "Those ribbons," he said quietly. "The ones on your uniform. I don't know what any of them mean." "Each one is a story," I said. "Not a single one is a joke." We let that sit between us, solid as the truck bed. He nodded once, a tiny bow toward a country he'd never visited but could now see on a map. A week later, he came by my house at dusk with a grocery sack full of tomatoes from someone's garden. He set them on the counter and said, "You got any salt?" It's a strange thing, the way contrition shows itself. Sometimes it's grand gestures and formal apologies. Sometimes it's a paper sack of tomatoes with paper towels underneath so they don't spot your counter. We ate standing up at my kitchen counter. He told me about the price of copper that week, about how the new kid at his shop had over-tightened a valve and learned humility the hard way. I told him about the sparrow bullying the blue jay off my feeder. "Huh," he said, because the world had delivered a perfect metaphor to my door and neither of us felt like making it work any harder. He didn't say he was proud. That word may never live comfortably in his mouth, and I was learning not to need it. But when he left, he opened the screen door slowly and carefully so it wouldn't slam. Consideration is its own dialect. I'll take it. In church that Sunday, we sat in the same pew we'd occupied for decades, the same window pouring wheat-coloured light over our shoulders. After the benediction, in the very same parking lot that had hosted so much of my humiliation over the years, a man from my father's bowling league stopped us. "Heard your girl gave quite a speech at that fancy wedding," he said to my father. My father lifted his chin, and for a terrible moment I thought he would deflect with a joke. But he didn't. "She didn't give a speech," he said clearly. "She gave a standard." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. The words were enough. Nothing in our story was fixed forever. The old patterns would probably try to reassert themselves. But the weather had changed. The climate, maybe. In the mailbox that afternoon, I found a card with a note written in Jennifer's neat lawyer handwriting. "Thank you for not making me the villain, even when it would have been easy. I'm learning to ask better questions. J." Inside was a photograph from the wedding. A candid shot the photographer had caught when I raised my glass for the second toast. The light had found me in a way that didn't feel like a spotlight, more like a window opening. I looked strong in it, certain, like someone who knew exactly who she was. I set the photo on my bookshelf beside a picture of my mother holding me at 6 months old. Both of us serious in our separate frames, both of us already practicing the art of being seen without asking permission. The phone stayed quiet that evening. The house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs. I made tea. I sat in my favorite chair. I breathed without counting or monitoring or bracing for the next cut. I let the day end without arguing with it. There would be more conversations with my father. More lines to draw, more boundaries to maintain. More Saturday memorials where we stood side by side without quite knowing how to stand together. More tomatoes delivered at dusk like peace offerings we were both too stubborn to name. But a truth had been spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses. And once a truth hears itself spoken, it keeps speaking. It doesn't go quiet again easily. I didn't need a new father. I needed the old one to stop using me as kindling for his own insecurities. He was learning, slowly, painfully. So was I. By the time summer deepened into August, the story of that wedding night had made its way through every coffee shop and church social in our small town. At the diner, people asked me about the groomsmen, about my service, about what it was really like over there. They didn't ask about my dress size anymore. They didn't make jokes about my weight. They called me by my name. They called me ma'am. Respect can arrive late, decades late, but it still counts when it comes. My father stayed quiet for weeks after the memorial. We didn't talk on the phone or meet for coffee. But he didn't disappear either. I'd see his truck outside the hardware store, his hunched figure pushing a cart at the grocery store. We orbited each other carefully, like veterans after a battle they're not ready to discuss, both of us healing in our own time. The breakthrough came one Sunday afternoon at my brother's house. A family cookout, the kind we'd had 100 times before. The men gathered around the grill like it was a sacred fire, swapping the same 3 stories they always told. My father wandered over with a plate of chicken wings, nodded at me, and then turned to the group. "This is my daughter," he said. Everyone looked. I braced myself, old reflexes dying hard, but he didn't smirk. He didn't reach for a punchline. He set his plate down and cleared his throat. "She runs things bigger than this grill. She takes care of people. That's all I'll say on it." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a full apology for decades of cruelty. But it was something. A beginning. Later that night, he stopped by my porch with a jar of homemade pickles from a neighbor's garden. "Figured you might like these," he muttered, not quite meeting my eyes. It was the closest he could come to saying he was sorry. I accepted the jar and we sat in rocking chairs on my porch. Not filling the silence, just letting it exist between us without weaponizing it. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't sound like trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it sounds like 2 people agreeing to put down their knives. I tell you this story not to humiliate my father, but to show what can grow even in rocky soil when someone decides to stop withholding water. He was raised in a world where men measured worth by waistlines and bank accounts, where showing emotion was weakness and kindness was something you couldn't afford. He passed that measuring stick to me because it was the only one he had. But that doesn't excuse the damage. Words are tools that can build or destroy. They're hammers that can shape or shatter. The lesson isn't complicated. Respect your children, even when they don't look like the picture you imagined. Especially then. The body you mock might be the one carrying a pack through mountains nobody else could climb. The quiet child you dismiss might be leading others through darkness you'll never see. For those listening who are parents or grandparents, what you say in public can wound for decades, or it can heal in an instant. You get to choose. For those listening who are still carrying the echo of cruel words from long ago, you are not defined by the laughter in that room. You are defined by the truth that eventually stands beside you, by the work you do when no one is watching, by the person you become despite everything. As for me, I no longer wait for my father to announce my worth to a room. I've learned that honor isn't granted by family introductions or approval. It's lived in the way you carry yourself when the lights are on you and when they're not. Still, I'll admit he's trying. He calls me by my name more often now. Sometimes he even asks about my work. Genuine questions instead of dismissive comments. He came to a veterans' breakfast last month and sat quietly while I spoke on a panel. Didn't make a single joke. That's a kind of victory. Small, daily, earned one careful conversation at a time. If you've stayed with me to the end of this story, I'd like to ask something simple. Think about the words you use with the people you love. Think about whether those words lift them up or weigh them down. Think about the difference between jokes that connect and jokes that cut. And if you've ever been mocked by someone who should have protected you, know this: their failure to see you doesn't mean you're invisible. It means they were too afraid to look. The greatest revenge isn't a glass of wine sprayed across a tablecloth, isn't public humiliation or righteous anger. The greatest revenge is becoming someone so solid in your own worth that their opinion becomes just weather passing through, not the climate you live in. The greatest victory is reconciliation, not forgetting, not pretending the wounds weren't deep, but building something new on ground that once held only hurt. That's honor in close quarters. That's what marriage is. That's what family can be, if we're brave enough to try. And sometimes, on the best days, that's what grace looks like. Two people in a cinder block shop standing over a socket set choosing to begin again.